We'll see. But okay, awesome. So we're going to talk about some international organizations because in Extemp speaking, chances are you're going to draw some question along your illustrious career about what can NATO do to respond to Russia's expansion into Ukraine? Or how can the European Union help assist the economies of Eastern Europe? Or like all those different sorts of questions, really. Like, how can the International Monetary Fund best meet Argentina's economic needs? You'll get lots of questions about international organizations. And then you'll also get even some domestic questions, like, how has President Trump impacted America's relationship with the World Bank Organization? And questions like that. So that's hopefully what we're going to talk about today. Go over a lot of these different types of organizations. And maybe, if time permits, we can actually finish a bit early and get some of our own little research into play. So we'll head back to these slides later if needed. This first organization, obviously NATO as the slide implies. So NATO Part 1. So NATO is this transatlantic security organization, and members of it included the United States, Canada, and European allies. The point being that we're trying to bolster security ties with one another and facilitate that sort of development. As we talked about before, the purpose is to safeguard the security and freedom of its members. And really, it's open to any European country who wants to further the Euro-Atlantic security cooperation and is willing to defend their allies. Now, some of the benefits of NATO include providing security benefits, right? After all, this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the point being to be a security alliance, spreading liberalism around the world, right? Upholding democracies, and finally, bolstering economic ties. This is more of an interesting one, right? But when you have security cooperation, you invariably have economic development that goes right alongside it. And so we've seen that ever since World War II. Part of the reason why the United States and Europe have been such great allies has been because our security development has gone hand in hand with economic development. Now, in terms of the Trump factor, so chances are President Trump has spoken about the organization. President Trump doesn't exactly like the NATO spending, right? So in 2014, all NATO members agreed to increase their defense spending to 2% of gross domestic product by 2014. We'll see if these things load. But the short thing is, the United States makes up about 70% of NATO's total budget, and they're really salty because a lot of the members of NATO aren't meeting that 2% GDP threshold. So 2% of their GDP is currently not being spent on defense spending. It doesn't look like we'll be able to see these graphs. I'll come back to it maybe when it's loaded later. But the point being this, President Trump's like, yo, NATO allies, you need to spend more. You're not spending enough, and you're taking advantage of American goodwill. On the other hand, people are like, yo, the agreement we signed in 2014 was that we had to increase our military spending to 2% of our GDP by 2024. So give us some time and we'll get to that goal. President Trump, on the other hand, is like, no, even then, like, given the current trajectory, it doesn't seem like he'll meet that goal. So there's that. Extra information, NATO was originally founded after World War II as a way of containing the the USSR's influence. And the US is the big player in NATO, comprising 70% of funding. Here's a quick question. Does anyone actually know what the Soviet Union's counterbalance, their version of NATO actually was?
Pact?
Yeah, what is it?
Pact?
Pact? Yeah, it was called the Warsaw Pact, exactly. And so it was basically the USSR and a bunch of Eastern European nations. And so that's the situation that's happening there, I guess, with NATO.
Now it's the BRF, I think.
Yeah, maybe we can research that organization if we have the time, because that'd be an interesting one to talk about. Okay, and then the second part is this how factor. How does NATO achieve its goals? So there are lots of different ways in which they do it. Number one is that they have this broader security network of over 40 countries from around the world, including in Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean areas. So, for example, NATO has a lot of strong security ties with South Korea, for example, and will conduct military relations and naval drills with that country. And we can also, station our ships there and our different sort of fighter planes there as well. Two is we have crisis management tools, like relief supplies. So during these crises, NATO can help send in important stuff like humanitarian aid and different things during those times of crisis. And it's actually pretty interesting because the United States, which you wouldn't expect to get help from NATO, actually did. And so during Hurricane Katrina, when basically all of New Orleans was like in this total crap show, a lot of NATO allies ended up sending relief supplies like blankets, food, clean water, etc. They can also help with the implementation of peace agreements, so helping to broker peace treaties between different groups. So like in Bosnia, for example, NATO was integral to getting a security framework passed through. And then also, not only can they create their own agreements, they'll enforce current ones. So the United Nations has created several peace mandates, including in countries like Libya and Somalia. And NATO helps facilitate those agreements and send in troops to make sure that they're really being executed to the best of their ability. Although in Libya, if you know anything about the news recently, you know that the UN-backed government there isn't doing so hot. And then they also have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance work together. So they'll usually look at things like illegal trafficking, so like the trafficking of humans, undocumented migration through the Mediterranean. NATO will crack down on that. They'll share different intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And then finally, there are these mutual defense treaties. So there's the mantra, an attack on one is an attack on all. 9/11 being the best exemplification of this treaty, where, you know, Al-Qaeda hit the Twin Towers, they try to attack the Pentagon, and one other location, which people don't know, but they suspect it was the White House. When that happened and the United States went to war in Afghanistan, NATO backed the United States. They helped us and provided us with all the security measures. So if you ever get a question like, how can NATO respond to like Russian expansionism in the like Crimea, for example, you have tons of different things they can do. You can talk about the implementation of peace agreements. You can talk about utilizing broader security networks. You can talk about sending in troops through mutual defense treaties. You can talk about intelligence negotiations. You can talk about surveillance measures, and you can talk about reconnaissance measures. All of these different things. Or you can talk about crisis management tools, right? Helping the innocent people who have been affected by this war. So all of these different things NATO can do, and all of these clear solvency mechanisms that hopefully make sense. Are there any questions about NATO? Okay, sounds good. If you do think of a question later on, at the end of one of our other organizations, feel free to ask it. All right, what's this organization for our flag aficionados?
The World Health Organization?
No.
Or the UN?
The UN.
The UN. So this is the United Nations, right? And basically every member of, like every officially recognized country in the world, with the exception of Palestine, Taiwan, and Kosovo, will have like these interesting like semi-quasi-independence relations, do not have full membership. But besides them, like basically every country in the world has it. There are a couple other countries that don't have full membership or like don't have any recognition. So those are like the really weird countries like Balochistan, for example, that aren't really recognized by the international community, or Kurdistan. The purpose of the United Nations is to promote international peace and friendly relationships between states, with any quote-unquote peace-loving states that can carry out the United Nations Charter. In terms of benefits, the United Nations helps bolster economic ties. It provides security benefits, and it improves global diplomacy. So in terms of bolstering economic ties, that's pretty intuitive, right? You're getting to the negotiating table, you're talking about different ways that countries can work together to improve economic development. Security benefits, if we go back a couple of slides, right? We talked about how there are these UN peace mandates in countries like Libya and Somalia, so clearly they have a strong status there. And then finally, improving global diplomacy. The United Nations is really the largest forum in the world, and it helps, I guess, improve global diplomacy. So first off, I want to see if these charts with NATO have loaded. It doesn't look like it, so I guess you guys, when I share the presentation, you guys can head back to that whenever. So let me X out at that then. But here's the Trump factor. He said a lot of different things about the United Nations. In short, he's like, look, the United States, we pay a lot for the UN budget, about 22%, and almost 30% of UN peacekeeping. But the UN is like this underperformer with tremendous potential. And I think that really does a good job of encompassing President Trump's views on the UN. He doesn't completely disregard the multilateral institution as important, but he does think it has, I guess, a lot more potential. And in terms of extra information, the United Nations was originally founded after World War II as a way to prevent future conflicts. And it also has a ton of sub-councils like the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Security Council, and more. Speaking of which, does anyone know what the United Nations Security Council does and who are the 5 members of that? Anyone? Or you want to have a guess for like who are some of the more powerful, I suppose, nations?
Is it like U.S., China,
Big bad Russia.
Yeah, Russia, US, China,
yeah.
and then there are 2 more.
I'm pretty sure India wasn't in it, but there's like a big conflict that India wanted to be in.
Yeah, exactly. India did want to be in it. Same with Germany too. The other,
And France and Germany, I think.
not Germany, the United Kingdom. Keep in mind this was after World War II, right? So they were a little bit wary.
Oh, the League of Nations.
Yeah. So basically, you had those 5 countries: the U.S., China, Russia, France, and the UK. Then you have a couple countries that are trying to jockey for power, maybe become the next member of the UN Security Council. But in effect, the UN Security Council has like this really far-reaching power, where basically, let's say every other member of the United Nations passes this resolution. If one of the members of the UN Security Council, even one, vetoes it, so you could have basically 192 countries vote for a resolution, but one of the Security Council members vote against it, then that resolution goes kaput, right? And so that's really important on a lot of measures, which is why, resolving crises like Israel-Palestine or sanctioning countries through the United Nations is more complicated than it seems. The reason basically being that the UN is oftentimes stuck at these impasses because of the Security Council. And in terms of their how factor, there are a couple things the UN does. Number one, they have UN peacekeepers to help stabilize countries. So you can think about this like a military force. I believe that there are over 90,000 people who are active UN peacekeepers, and then 100,000 folks in the reserves for that. And you'll see them in a lot of different places as well. They also have crisis management tools like relief supplies and foreign aid. So a good example of that was in Haiti, which underwent this earthquake, I believe, back in 2010. The United Nations helped send a lot of relief supplies and foreign aid, getting funding from other nations, coordinating that, and more. They also help, that's a typo there, but it's supposed to say help broker peace treaties. So we talked about Somalia a couple slides back. Libya is the other example, right? So they can help broker peace treaties between different sides, providing that important forum for negotiations. They can do international sanctions. So for example, against Iran, we saw a bunch of countries, it's called the P5+1. So those are members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, who all collectively agreed to take off sanctions from Iran in exchange for them agreeing to abandon their nuclear program for 25 years. That was the Iran nuclear deal. So they can sanction places, although it's really hard to sanction things through the United Nations just because of how divisive it is. And we see that through the United Nations Security Council. And then finally, they can investigate member disputes. So it's like, let's say Russia and Ukraine have some beef, they can investigate that, try to come to some sort of agreement. And finally, they can investigate human rights violations, look more into depth on that with like the United Nations Human Rights Council. Any questions about the United Nations?
So like, why does the Security Council exist then if they have like pretty much an extended citizenship out of all the global countries?
If only I knew, dude. Main reason why though was because the United Nations was not always this worldly multilateral institution that had basically every peace-loving nation on it. And that includes even like North Korea. Originally, right, it was like those big countries after World War II, and the United States just like decided to hop on eventually as well. And it's because of their outsized influence that they were able to forge that. And the thing is, I mean, it's not like the only way that you could disband the United Nations Security Council then is by having members of the United Nations Security Council agree to disband themselves. So you see how there's like this inherent conflict of interest there? So it adds difficulties. But yeah, definitely, that's why you see a lot of people say like the United Nations is this toothless organization. They can't do crap. And a large part of that, they say, is because of the UN Security Council.
Huh.
Any other questions? All right, cool. Feel free to ask them along any part of the way, right? This is a pretty dense one, but like dense lecture, but I really just wanted to have lots of information chock full of content. All right, let's see. going back to our flag experts, can anyone tell me what this flag is?
Is that not the International Court for Justice's flag?
Close. It's the International Criminal Court, or the ICC.
Sorry about that.
I don't really know the distinction between the two, so no worries. So there are 123 members, although there are a lot of notable non-members like the US. So I want to click on this link, which tells you the members. And maybe you can help me notice which countries aren't involved and which ones aren't. So you have the state parties, which are full members, signatories that have not ratified. So occasionally they may collaborate with the ICC, but they don't give any funding or anything like that. And then you have non-state parties, non-signatories, which means, no, screw you, you can't investigate anything. So what do you notice about which regions have lots of signatories and which places don't? Any big countries you see that are non-state parties, non-signatories, or signatories that have not ratified?
India, China, Russia,
Exactly.
America.
So we have India and China, which have just completely not signed into it. And then you have countries like Russia and the United States who are signatories that have not ratified. I believe it's the Rome Statute, which basically like puts in effect the ICC, so they're like observers to it. And then you'll notice all the South American countries, which is interesting. And then European countries, even some African ones, and then Canada. So yeah, those are like the members of the ICC.
So like, what does it mean to be a signatory that has not ratified?
Right, so basically it just means like you observe the ICC, you're like, I guess we think this is important. And occasionally you may help out with like ICC investigations, but you don't give the ICC any funding. So it's really like a meaningless designation. It's functionally the same as being put in the red, because you still have full control over your own like sovereignty. You're like fully like autonomous in that respect, I suppose. But it's just to be like, I guess we think the ICC is cool. So yeah.
Okay.
The purpose of it is to investigate individuals charged with the gravest crimes, so like crimes against humanity, and basically any country willing to help out the ICC in finding criminals can join. The benefits being it ensures human rights are protected around the globe and helps uphold that. The Trump factor is that President Trump recently authorized, so back in June 11th of this year, he recently authorized sanctions against ICC criminal court officials, which is really interesting. These are people trying to fight against crimes against humanity, and also visa restrictions on ICC personnel. Why do you think President Trump did that? Does anyone who's kept up with the news know? All right. Well, here's like the short version of it. Basically, a lot of US soldiers are being investigated for their human rights abuses in Afghanistan. So the ICC was trying to investigate that. President Trump didn't really like that, so he authorized sanctions and visa restrictions on ICC personnel so that their jurisdictional power was significantly curtailed. And here's some extra information. 1 out of every 5 members of the ICC hasn't fully paid their dues. Right? So if you're a member of the ICC, you have to pay money to keep the organization afloat, which hurts their investigatory powers. Why do you think that might be? Like, why might having not enough funding hurt the ICC?
They probably have to like pay governments for access into certain information.
Yeah, so like keep in mind the ICC has to have huge legal team. They have to travel a lot. If you don't have enough money, then it becomes significantly harder to do your job. So next, in terms of the how factor of the ICC. So the ICC really only prosecutes cases of member states when those states are either 1, unwilling to, or 2, unable to prosecute cases. So that's really what makes the ICC so ineffective. They can only investigate the cases of member states, which means in China, for example, where you have several grave human rights situations, the ICC can in effect do nothing about it. So yeah, that's like the big criticism of the ICC. They don't really work. In terms of what they do, they facilitate this democratic trial, making sure that, both the accused and the accuser get the ability to speak about this issue. And that helps provide survivors with an outlet, which is called victim participation. So they're able to basically bring these accusations directly to the one person in question, the person who's being accused, and they can speak their story. And then they can also secure reparations based on that for like the irreparable damage that was basically inflicted upon them. In the ICC, we talked about how they can try different things as war crimes. So like recently they tried the destruction of cultural heritage as a crime against humanity. So pretty interesting stuff there. And if deemed guilty, the people in question are convicted. However, while there are 40 current indictments, so like cases being brought against people, there have only ever been 2 ever convicted. And both of them did really messed up stuff. Thomas
2
Dubois,
convictions ever?
yeah, and Bosco Ntaganda. So really the ICC is more of a symbolic organization, which has lots of potential. That potential is being sullied by international obstruction and also the fact that they can only prosecute cases of member states. So chances are if you're a country like Saudi Arabia or China, you're not exactly gonna have a warm embrace of the ICC. Any questions about the ICC and that organization?
So like, why is it that there have only been 2 people convicted in like the entire history of it? Like, what is making it go so slow, even if it is only member states?
Well, it's a couple of things. Number one, it's the bar to prove a crime against humanity is really high, right? And so when you're trying something that high of a crime, it becomes really hard to be able to secure a conviction. Number two, it's the fact that the ICC is so underfunded, right? 1 out of every 5 member states has not fully paid their dues. And we talked about how that curtails their investigatory powers. And then 3, beyond that indirect obstructionism, you see more direct obstruction of justice by countries like the US, who have sanctioned ICC officials, they've removed visas, and that sort of stuff, which directly hurts their ability to fully investigate cases. So those are like the big 3 factors.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? All right, awesome. All right, this one, the name is right here.
Oh no.
The International Monetary Fund, the fabled IMF. Okay, so basically the entire world is a member of the IMF. They have 189 members, with its purpose being to ensure the stability of the international financial system and help countries alleviate their economic crises. In order to join, a country must be approved by a majority of other member nations, with the benefits being to ensure global monetary stability. In terms of the Trump factor, surprisingly, the IMF has been one of those things where there's been rather little confrontation between the two. So the IMF and Trump are actually on pretty good notes. And as of 2016, the IMF had a fund of $666 billion, which means it has a lot of economic sway and the ability to bail out countries. Now, in terms of how it gets its funds, it gets it in a similar way to the ICC through member quotas. The bigger the country, the bigger the position they have in the global economy, the more they have to pay in quotas. So economies like China or the United States have to pay a lot, while smaller ones, or like New Zealand, for example, or another one could be like Mozambique, they don't have to pay as much to the IMF. And then in terms of their how factor, there are a couple of different things. The first is surveillance. The IMF regularly monitors economic development and conducts in-depth appraisals of each member's economy, discussing how they can further grow. Next off is technical assistance and training. So if surveillance is the diagnosis, what's wrong with your economy, technical assistance and training is the prognosis, the specific tools that they can implement to address those and ameliorate those problems. And so the IMF helps provide practical guidance and training on how to upgrade institutions like central banks and treasuries and design appropriate macroeconomic, financial, and structural policies. And then finally, the thing that they're most famous for, lending and bailouts. So usually the IMF will give a ton of money under something called privileged creditor status. What that means is that the IMF will pay the debts of a country in full, or like however much they need, they're appealing for. In exchange though, the expectation is that the IMF eventually gets paid back in full, and then they get to like set the conditions of the bailout. And so usually when the IMF gives out a bailout package, it's paired with substantive policy changes and austerity measures. Austerity being either raising taxes or cutting spending, or some mix of both to curb the national debt. And you may have heard about the IMF in the news recently because they bailed out Argentina for like the 20th time. Or no, the 8th time, I apologize. They've sent over 38 packages though. And they've also bailed out Pakistan on several occasions as well. Any questions about the International Monetary Fund?
Yeah, so like, so if the bailing out is just one of the services, when is an instance where the USA has benefited from one of the other two services, like the surveillance and the prognosis?
Well, it's because you're trying to maintain like global financial stability, right? You don't want to have a bunch of countries which have weak macroeconomic financial institutions. And so the point of the surveillance measures and the technical assistance and training is to help make sure that these countries know exactly what they're doing to mitigate any sort of economic crisis, and also to help maintain the stability of the global financial system at large. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
So like then like, what is the IMF going to be doing in response to like COVID, since now like the entire world's economy has pretty much recessioned?
So the IMF is almost like a measure of last resort, right? In terms of that, usually it's the national governments that will try to do a mix of like government spending and then monetary policy, which is central bank related things, to mitigate their economic crisis. But let's say things hypothetically get super bad and a country gets into a ton of debt. The IMF can help out with those bailouts and stabilize their economic spending. I think the thing to notice about this is COVID-19 will probably hurt the IMF, mainly because it means a lot of countries will be unable to fully follow in on the IMF's conditions. So like Argentina, for example, like they can't cut spending right now when they're facing an unprecedented economic crisis. They're probably going to have to increase spending, at least in the short term, to prevent mass poverty. And so, in other words, the IMF really just threw good money after that. But the other things that they could probably help out with is like the surveillance, technical assistance, and training. With the COVID-19 pandemic, they could be like, yo, here are a couple of different ways that, and a couple unconventional monetary policies and fiscal policies that you could try out to grow your economy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about the IMF? All right. Awesome. Let's move on. What is this organization?
The European Union.
Yes, the EU, or as Britain called it, EU. That's a corny joke. But so there are 27 member states of the European Union, with the point being to establish a unified economic and monetary system, promote peace, break down trade barriers, and encourage scientific developments. In terms of who can join / how to join, so a country must be part of Europe, obviously. It must implement all EU regulations, meet the conditions for membership, so be a stable democracy, a free market economy, and have relative economic strength compared to other European Union members, and be approved by Parliament. The benefits being a stronger economy, but beyond that, I think also just having like stable democratic relationship with others. If you attended my economics lecture, you also know that with a stronger economy and with these broken down trade barriers, it decreases the probability of war. And if you don't know much about that, I'd recommend reading into capitalist peace theory. In terms of the Trump factor, President Trump doesn't exactly like the EU right now. He's not super happy with the trade relationship between the two. This article can load. So Trump said the EU is one of the United States' biggest foes. And then other times he says different things. So interesting relationship Trump has with the European Union. Then extra information, Britain just pulled out of the European Union in January of 2020. And then some other really important stuff I think to talk about. There's been like general criticism of the European Union, right? The conditions for membership are that you have to be a stable democracy and free market, stable economy. But you saw a bunch of countries like Greece, which have really suffered under EU membership because they don't meet those conditions. And so the European Union has this tough balancing act where they have to like make sure they're delegating enough funds to each country while still keeping them satisfied. And then in terms of other important stuff, there's also like the disputes over like the stable democracy. They're like, why are you letting countries like Hungary in? Hungary literally calls itself an illiberal democracy, which is almost like an oxymoron. So yeah, basically the European Union is not in a super strong position. And in terms of the how, they have a couple of different structures. So they have the Court of Justice of the European Union. They interpret EU laws and settle disputes. They can also impose financial penalties on member states who violate laws. Does anyone know why the Court of Justice has come into the news recently?
Because they've been prosecuting U.S. corporations like Apple for not paying their taxes.
Yeah.
That did not go well with the U.S.
That wasn't what I was actually thinking of, but that's definitely another example of the relevancy. I was thinking about what happened in Poland. So basically, Poland was slowly stripping away the judicial independence of its courts, which basically meant that its courts were starting to become political institutions, even though their job should really just be to interpret the law and lay it down for the rest of the land. And so recently, they started to impose financial penalties onto Poland for those like flagrant violations of, I guess, democracy, really. Next, you have the European People's Parliament. They approve EU laws, approve member states, approve European Council members, and approve international trade agreements. They have these democratic elections. They're the second largest showing of democracy in the world, about because like you have the entire European Union really voting to send people to the EPP. And yeah, you have like different political factions. So you'll have like a coalition of centrist parties, a coalition of green parties, a coalition of anti-immigrant parties, etc. Then you have the European Commission. They propose laws, they manage the budget, they implement decisions, issue regulations, and represent the European Union around the world. If a country fails to adhere to EU laws, the Commission can also take legal action against the country. And then finally,
Something to note. Sorry. Yeah. Something to note. The European Parliament nowadays is virtually powerless. Like, they hold no authority. They can hear legislature, but they can't actually like pass. They can't actually propose it. So really, all power rests within the European Commission and the European Council.
exactly. Yeah, and the key word here is like, look, how they're all the propose, the manage, the implement, the issues. Well, it's just approve, 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 approve. And so they don't really, I guess, do too much. They're just like the rubber stamp organization. And then finally, you have the European Central Bank. They manage the euro, which is this currency a lot of European member unions use. And then they also regulate the EU banking system. And as a last resort, they can also lend money to countries in the Eurozone. The reason why the European Central Bank has come under criticism recently is because, let's say you have a currency like the euro, right? You have tons of different countries using the euro. Your difficult task is making sure that you print enough money during financial crises so that those weaker economies get the economic boost necessary, while not totally tanking the euro as a currency, thus hurting those larger economies. So you have to have this difficult balancing act of meeting the economic interests of those larger members like France and Germany, while still being able to attend to the needs of smaller nations like Greece. Which is why if we go back a slide, we talked about one of the reasons why there's this criticism is like, you have to be that free market and stable economy, but people are like, why were we letting in countries like Greece then? Because they're clearly hurting us. And so that's why you start to see this sort of schism between northern countries in Europe, who are more financially stable versus southern ones, and Western countries in Europe, which are more financially stable than Eastern ones. Any questions, I guess, about that? All right, looks like we're pretty good on the European Council.
Just a quick thing. So, like, what specifically was it that made Britain want to
Leave? Yeah. So in short, the European Union, right, there's like this assumption that when you join the EU, you have to break down trade barriers, you're gonna have to pay membership dues, all that different sort of stuff. And then the really controversial one is under this thing called the Schengen Agreement, which basically talks about the importance of free movement of people across the European Union. And so a lot of British citizens didn't like that. They viewed that as violating their sovereignty. And so Brexit was viewed as this campaign to take back Britain. not to have to, accept a certain number of migrants that the European Union has delegated to be able to control their own trade policies and trade barriers, etc. But the harms of Brexit are that it's not really a moment to reclaim themselves as much as it is something that's delegitimized the United Kingdom on the world stage and really hurt their ability to conduct free trade and free movement effectively with other European Union members. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions about the European Union? Cool. Next up, we got the World Health Organization, pretty relevant recently with all of this COVID-19 crap. So the World Health Organization, basically every country in the world except Liechtenstein, Taiwan, Palestine, the Cook Islands, and I believe it's pronounced NEU are part of it, with the purpose being to promote health, keep the world safe, and serve the vulnerable. Countries must ratify the treaty known as the Constitution of the World Health Organization in order to join. I forgot to type the benefits section, but it's pretty intuitive, as you could basically just apply the purpose to the benefits as well. Promote health, keep the world safe, and serve the vulnerable. In terms of the Trump factor, President Trump officially withdrew. So it's not officially withdrawing, he's actually done it now. The United States from the World Health Organization. And it was founded in 1948 by the United Nations. In terms of the how factor, they do a couple of things. Number one, they coordinate international responses to health emergencies. They can set aside resources and make sure that countries that need them the most are getting it. They set health guidelines and standards. Like, for example, in COVID-19, they talked about the importance of masks, the social distancing, number of 6 feet apart, all of that different stuff that local governments and state governments and national governments adopted. They advocate for providing health coverage to 1 billion people, so that's like one of their own goals outside of COVID-19. And they rely on member states to monitor and report crises, which can make it a little bit less suspect, I suppose is the right word, or more suspect, that's a better word, to lies, I guess. So, for example, China infamously underreported their COVID-19 cases. And they can also declare a public health emergency of international concern, otherwise known as a PHEIC, wherein the World Health Organization issues guidance on its members on how to respond to a crisis, examples being trade and travel restrictions. And then they receive funding primarily from donations and mandatory payments from member states, and distribute supplies to member states like tests and PPE, or personal protective equipment. Any questions about the World Health Organization?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So there are currently rumors that the reason why the U.S. withdrew was that the director of the WHO, Dr. Ghebreyesus, is currently under the control of the Chinese government. Given this, does the WHO still have a future as a powerful organization?
A good question. The first thing is probably to ask whether or not the legacy of President Trump has been permanently imprinted onto the World Health Organization. And quite frankly, I don't think it has been. Yes, President Trump has leave, but the United States can rejoin the organization at any time. Keep in mind that the United States provides about, I believe, 25% of the World Health Organization's funding, making it, I believe, the largest funder, if not the second largest. Maybe China's ahead of it. And so the World Health Organization needs the United States a lot. And so they'd be more than happy to embrace the US were to rejoin. Which brings us to the next thing. Let's say Biden wins the presidential election, which all the polls are suggesting he does. I definitely think he'd rejoin the WHO as quickly as possible. The other thing, too, is to, I guess, address the legitimacy of the World Health Organization, because, quite frankly, they have been suspect to Chinese influence. Examples being, they just, they asked, what should Taiwan do? They kept referring to it as China, as an example, not recognizing Taiwan as its, own little country. And so that's, all the different stuff. And so the United States has not been the only country to raise concerns over that. Lots of other countries have been as well. And so I guess there's that factor to consider as well. At large, though, I think for the most part, the World Health Organization will probably stand to benefit from COVID-19 just because it's put a spotlight on the importance of public health advocacy. And so we've started to see extra funding for the World Health Organization. We've started to see more respect. And yes, there are people who are claiming that China has undue influence within the organization, but by and large, it's still an incredibly important institution. I know I rambled there for a bit, but did I answer your question, Arjun?
Yes, you did.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right, cool. What's this one? Anyone know? It's a really weird looking flag.
I have a quick question. I was muted.
Oh,
So like, if the World Health Organization was potentially corrupt under like China's influence, is there another international organization that would investigate them in cases like this?
I think that's more of like a member state thing where they have to directly investigate the World Health Organization. I don't know if there are any institutions that oversee the WHO. Let me just double check that real quick. Because, yeah, I think what happens is member nations investigate them instead. So the World Health Organization is a specialized agency at the United Nations. So I suppose the United Nations could investigate the World Health Organization as well. But here's the thing, right? Like even that's like more of a political question too, right? Yes, the World Health Organization may not recognize Taiwan as its own independent country, but we're talking about health policy. And so at the end of the day, I do think that, quite frankly, like especially now given COVID-19, now is not the time to like bring up those accusations and cry foul, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Awesome. So let's go back to this flag then. Can anyone tell me what this flag is?
Is this the WTO?
It is not.
Is it the OPEC?
Yeah, it's OPEC.
Oh,
It's a,
that's OPEC?
yeah, I know.
Oh, okay.
I
I
think
hate that
O.
flag.
The O, this is like the P, this is the,
That's not
and then this is the C.
That's
horrible flag.
Yeah, I think it's more modern. Looks like a butter.
Pac-Man with 3.
But basically, there's 16 members of OPEC, 5 in the Middle East, 7 in Africa, 1 in South America, and a couple others scattered elsewhere. With the purpose being to create a cohesive set of oil prices within its member states in order to stabilize the oil market and keep oil profits high for member states. If you attended my economics lecture, you know that that's why some people call OPEC a cartel. It's because basically the way that they're doing it, it's like, hey, we're going to agree to set a limit on the supply of oil to push up or push down prices, right? And so in order to join, you must have a substantial net export of crude oil and get a 3/4 majority of all members approving of you, and also approval of all founding members. So that's Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. In terms of its benefits, it protects your oil profits and stability, which is really nice. And the Trump factor, President Trump has been pretty inconsistent when it comes to OPEC. So he's long cast OPEC as this evil force ripping Americans by not pumping enough oil. He called OPEC a monopoly, right? So that's like talking about that debate that must be broken up. And yeah, he's like been pretty critical of it. But now, flash forward to 2020, instead of slamming OPEC for artificially restraining production, Trump is urging the cartel to do just that, produce more oil and keep the oil taps flowing, I suppose. One other extra bit of information about OPEC. So OPEC Plus refers to all the non-OPEC countries that export crude oil. So I believe that's places like Russia, for example. And sometimes they'll also get together and try to extend their reach. And then OPEC member states produce 40% of all oil. So they have pretty big influence over oil markets. And then finally, in terms of the how, basically OPEC controls oil supply. By increasing or reducing how much oil is produced, they can keep prices stable by manipulating the supply-demand relationship. When they reduce the amount of oil being produced, oil prices go up because there's less supply. And likewise, when they increase how much oil is being produced, prices go down because there's more supply. Sometimes member states will not abide by production targets, which can also affect oil prices because it makes OPEC less effective and makes economies less certain. Good examples being like the standoff you'd see between Iraq and Iran. And then OPEC will also try to negotiate deals with OPEC Plus members, we talked about that before, to further control markets. And this was attempted when prices were plummeting at the beginning of the pandemic. One other thing to add about OPEC, look, like oil is becoming a dying out resource, or not dying out, but there's become, like, I guess, more international concern over the viability of fossil fuels as a long-term energy supply. And so with renewables trying to disrupt the market, that would also invariably disrupt OPEC members. And so really there's been lots of calls for OPEC nations to start to diversify their economies, which is why a lot of them will set up these things called sovereign wealth funds. They'll take some of the profits from oil and invest it into a more diversified slate of resources, so like retail, housing, automobile industry, etc. The point being to diversify their economy. Does that all make sense? I know that may have been a confusing explanation, but are there any questions about OPEC or anything I just said? All right, cool. Hopefully you're not getting too tired. I think we have just a couple more organizations. What's this one?
The African Union.
Exactly, yeah. This is the African Union. There are 55 African nations who are members of it, with the purpose being to help get rid of the vestiges of colonialism and facilitate cooperation within Africa. Basically, any African country can join, and in exchange you'll get economic ties, security benefits, and strengthened democracy in Africa. In terms of the Trump factor, the African Union has worked to bolster their ties, particularly the security ties with the United States. But that said, they're still mad about President Trump's 2018 comments, where he said some stuff I can't say, but basically he alluded to them as like a crap hole, but the more impolite version of that. Then extra information, this is a relatively new organization founded in 2002, and they operate very similar to the European Union, hence why you have the European Union and the African Union. And in terms of the how, they remove restrictive visas to facilitate easier movement across the country, very similar to the European Union Schengen Agreement. They've adopted human rights initiatives and resolutions, committing themselves to promoting like women's rights, for example. They've helped finance important projects by utilizing the African Monetary Fund, the African Central Bank, the African Investment Bank. They've brokered free trade deals like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And then there's also regional peacekeeping. They'll oftentimes collaborate with United Nations and send African Union peacekeepers. So they'll do that in places like Somalia. Any questions about the African Union? That was pretty fast.
So like what has been their progress so far since they've like been created in 2002?
It's been mixed. So on certain issues, like, you know, mediating conflicts, for example, there's not much they can do besides send like peacekeepers. And so it serves as a good reactive measure, but not a great preventative one. It's been a great forum for discussion, and I think it's done a good job with that. And we saw how it helped facilitate this huge free trade agreement, which is going to drastically improve trade across the African continent. But that said, they definitely have a lot more progress to go in terms of human rights and really making sure that member states follow through on their expectations of moving toward democracies. So overall, I'd say it's doing pretty good, but there's definitely room for improvement, and so I'd say its grade's been like a B+. Any other questions? Awesome. I think we have one or two more. What is this organization? This one's a weird flag. I'll say that. But let's see if anyone can guess this.
What is this flag?
All right, I'll give you a hint. It starts with A, and it is 5 letters.
ASEAN.
Exactly.
Oh my God, why is this the flag for ASEAN?
I don't know, but this is ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Basically, as I said before, Southeast Asian nations. So member states include places like, this can load, it would say things like Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. And there's this big misconception that China is a member of ASEAN. It's not, so don't say that in your speeches or analysis. That's just what I really wanted to get out of the way. And then in terms of their purpose, they try to help promote, Arjun, can you mute yourself, by the way? I can hear like keyboard back. Thanks. In terms of their purpose, they help promote greater ties amongst Southeast Asian countries, and basically any of those Southeast Asian nations can join, with the benefits being to bolster economic ties, provide security benefits, provide a forum for discussion. In terms of the Trump factor, the United States has recognized the importance of ASEAN ever since the foundation of the organization, and ever since China began to rise on the world stage, and we saw like Southeast Asia become like this new hub of economic development and population boost growth, it became a really big priority, especially under the Obama administration, to facilitate more cooperation with them. In terms of extra information, their collective GDP is $2.8 trillion. So it's a pretty big group of countries when we talk about economic might. And then in terms of the how has ASEAN achieved their goals and what do they do? So they've established a free trade area to significantly boost trade in the region. They've adopted human rights initiatives and resolutions and established a commission to oversee 10 countries, making sure they follow through on that. They've promoted stability by making ASEAN a nuclear-free zone and have like a general principle called the ASEAN Way. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then they've helped with economic development, including with financial integration, food security, job training, and different ways to improve financial institutions. And then finally, they do occasionally conduct military exercises, but beyond that, their security cooperation is pretty toothless. As an example of that, look at the South China Sea, where countries like the Philippines and Vietnam have requested help. ASEAN has something called the ASEAN Way, where they're like push for minimal intervention, because they're trying to balance strong relationships with China and the United States, and the best way to do that is honestly just to stay silent. Any questions about ASEAN?
So like, has China made any encroachments on any ASEAN member states, and has that affected the relationship?
Yeah.
All of them.
So we talked about the South China Sea as an example. That's this place that oversees 40% of global trade. It has tons of barrels of oil tucked within it and natural gas. And beyond that, it's a great place to have a military presence because the United States stations a lot of their military out of that region. And so what China has done is it's encroached on territories of ASEAN member states. So we talked about Vietnam as an example. And so that's led to criticism because a lot of ASEAN members haven't really stood up for Vietnam. Any other questions about ASEAN? Comments, concerns? Cool. We have one more. All right, let's guess this one. Anyone?
World Trade Organization.
Close. You're one letter off, or one word off. It's the World Bank Organization, or just the World Bank, I guess, yeah. But basically, there are 189 members, so basically the entire world, with the purpose being to reduce poverty by offering assistance in poorer nations. So they're basically like the nicer brother of the IMF. While the IMF is focused on maintaining the stability of global finance, often through like these harsh austerity measures, the World Bank is more focused on poverty reduction. And basically, any country approved by a majority of member states can join, with benefits being to bolster economic and human rights ties. In terms of the Trump factor, there isn't too much, but President Trump has asked for the World Bank to stop financing in China, who receives the bulk of World Bank financing. Extra information, in 2019, they lended about $9 billion for 54 different operations. So a lot smaller than the budget on like the $660 billion reserves that the IMF has. And they have two principal goals for 2030. One, end extreme poverty, reducing the number of people living on $1.90 a day to less than 3%. And two, promote shared prosperity by growing the incomes of the bottom 40% in every country. Although they do rely on self-reporting, which makes that data a little bit more dubious. And in terms of the how factor, they'll provide low interest loans in important areas like education and public health. They've managed the Clean Technology Fund. And in 2017, they stopped financing fossil fuel development. They help with knowledge sharing, offering support to developing countries through policy advice, research and analysis, and technical assistance. They've launched several global food security programs as well, partnering with nonprofit organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Any questions about the World Bank organization? All right, that's my last slide. Are there any questions about any of these organizations looking back? Things that the explanation may be a bit unclear for?
So like how often do like several of these work together? Like for example, like ASEAN like talking and collaborating with the European Union.
Oh, all the time. So
Okay.
like a lot of these international organizations will work hand in hand on projects. Obviously, there's some exceptions. Like you probably won't see, like, I'm trying to think of the best example. Honestly, it's hard to because like a lot of these people work with each other pretty frequently. So yeah, they definitely all work together, which is really nice. Any other questions? Last minute questions? Okay, cool. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop